On a chilly autumn morning in the quiet, sleepy town of Serenity Valley, a strange silence blanketed the streets. The early fog hung thick, lending an eerie stillness to the dawn. As the town slowly woke up, Lyle Fisher, a retired teacher and lifelong resident, set out for his daily walk. He always walked his dog past the familiar houses on Maple Street, exchanging friendly nods with any early risers. But today, his steps slowed as he approached the Hendricks residence. Something seemed off. The house was perfectly still, the front door left slightly ajar, and a dim porch light flickered against the creeping daylight, a stark difference from the usual neat, orderly appearance of the Hendricks home. Celia Hendricks, known around town for her meticulousness, would never leave things in disarray. An uneasy feeling gripped him as he looked around, calling out softly, but no one answered. Against his better judgment, Lyle moved closer, nudging the door open. Inside, the house was silent and unnervingly still, the only sound a clock ticking faintly in the hall. The furniture was intact, yet the unsettling silence weighed heavily. A faint metallic scent filled the air, growing stronger as Lyle stepped into the living room. There, in the middle of the floor, lay Celia Hendricks, motionless. Her auburn hair sprawled across the carpet, her blouse stained with dark patches. Sitting beside her, his gaze vacant and hands smeared with what looked like blood, was her husband, Franklin Hendricks. Lyle's heart raced, his breath catching as he took in the scene. He turned, stumbling back outside, fumbling for his phone to call the police. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the morning air, slicing through the usual calm of Serenity Valley. The neighbors began gathering, cloaked in their bathrobes and murmuring among themselves as the police set up a perimeter around the Hendricks home. The small crowd exchanged uneasy glances, whispers filling the air about what might have happened. No one could believe it. Celia was well-liked, charming, and hospitable, and the Hendricks family had always appeared to be a model couple. Detective Rosalind Carter arrived swiftly, assessing the scene with practiced eyes. She had worked cases like this before, but the aura of stillness in Franklin's unsettling blankness left her feeling a rare chill. Entering the house, she took in the details carefully. The blood on Franklin's hands, the disarray of a picture frame shattered on the floor, the eerie absence of any signs of forced entry. Franklin sat immobile, barely acknowledging her presence. When she finally asked him to recount what had happened, he simply looked past her, his expression dazed, muttering incoherently about coming home to find her like this. The detective's instincts flared as she took in his vague, detached responses. Franklin's words and demeanor didn't sit right, and as she directed officers to begin the evidence-gathering process, she noticed other unusual details. Celia's phone, lying untouched on the coffee table, revealed a series of text messages from an unknown contact, identified only as G, with whom she seemed to be sharing more than just friendly conversations. The language was emotional, almost intimate, a clue that sent a ripple of suspicion through Carter's mind. Outside, the neighbors watched with growing intrigue and fear, speculation already starting to take root. Some of them whispered about hearing arguments between Franklin and Celia over the past few months, their voices tense and strained. Others mentioned seeing Gerald Hendricks, Franklin's father, visiting the home unusually often, his presence somehow feeling unsettling now, in retrospect. Detective Carter pieced together the initial fragments, her intuition telling her that something far more twisted was beneath the surface. Franklin's odd, disoriented state could be genuine shock or a carefully crafted mask, and the hints of a connection between Celia and G might point to a motive far darker than any ordinary marital conflict. As the morning sun broke through the fog, casting long shadows over the scene, Carter stood on the doorstep of the Hendricks home, looking out over the gathering crowd. Her thoughts lingered on Franklin's blank stare and the cryptic messages on Celia's phone. Something was amiss in Serenity Valley, and as she prepared to dive deeper into the lives of the Hendricks family, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a case that would unravel secrets the town never wanted exposed. As the crowd around the Hendricks home slowly dispersed, murmuring with shock and disbelief, Detective Rosalind Carter steeled herself for what lay ahead. The scene inside was etched into her mind. The stillness of Celia Hendricks, the blood smeared across Franklin's hands, and the shattered picture frame near her body. Franklin's odd, detached demeanor continued to unsettle her, and his disjointed responses raised more questions than answers. She had a gut feeling that this case would be anything but simple. Carter began by retracing Franklin's steps. She questioned the officers who had initially responded to the scene, noting each observation carefully. They described Franklin as frozen, almost in a state of shock, barely responsive. His only statement to them had been a vague, haunting mutter about finding her like that. His lack of clarity and obvious disorientation left her uncertain whether his reaction was one of genuine grief or an attempt to mask something far more sinister. The first step in the investigation was the physical evidence. Carter ordered a thorough examination of the living room where Celia had been found. Forensics combed the area, collecting samples of the blood, fingerprints, and any other materials that could provide clues. Meanwhile, Carter herself went through the broken picture frame, which had once held a photo of Franklin Celia and Franklin's father, Gerald Hendricks. The frame's glass lay scattered across the floor, hinting at a struggle or an emotional outburst. Perhaps Celia had grabbed it during the confrontation, or maybe Franklin had smashed it in a fit of rage. As Carter studied the photo, she couldn't ignore the unease surrounding Gerald Hendricks. There were whispers among the neighbors about Gerald's frequent visits to the house, and something about his presence in the photo felt oddly significant. He had an air of confidence, even charm, that contrasted with Franklin's reserved nature. She wondered if this dynamic between father and son could reveal a motive or shed light on the tensions within the family. Carter turned her attention to Celia's phone, which sat on the coffee table, untouched since the scene had been processed. Scrolling through her recent messages, she quickly found the contact listed as G, the mysterious figure who had sent Celia a string of increasingly emotional and intimate texts. Some messages hinted at shared secrets, while others contained brief but charged phrases like, "We can't keep doing this," and "It has to end soon." Each message drove home the sense of a hidden relationship, and Carter felt a chill as she considered the implications. The text hinted that Celia had been conflicted about this relationship, perhaps trying to end it or distance herself. Whoever G was, he held a dangerous hold over her, one that had clearly caused her distress. After making note of the messages, Carter decided it was time to interview Franklin. Seated in a sterile, dimly lit room at the police station, Franklin stared blankly at the table in front of him, his eyes distant. He looked worn and disheveled, as though he hadn't slept in days. Carter approached him with caution, choosing her words carefully as she began the questioning. "Franklin, can you tell me about the last time you saw Celia?" she asked, watching him intently. Franklin's eyes flickered slightly, but his expression remained hollow. He hesitated, and for a moment, Carter thought he wouldn't respond at all, but eventually he began to speak, his voice barely a whisper. I came home, and she was lying there. I couldn't believe it. She was just gone." His words were fractured, laden with shock, yet Carter sensed a layer of emotion that he was holding back. She pressed further, carefully. "Franklin, did you and Celia have any disagreements recently? Was there anything that might have caused tension between you?" He hesitated again, his hands clenching into fists as he swallowed hard. We weren't getting along, if that's what you mean. Things had been difficult, but I never wanted this." Carter noted his words, her mind racing as she pieced together the fragments of his story. His vague responses only deepened her suspicions, but without a clear admission or a stronger lead, she couldn't draw any definitive conclusions. Yet one thing was clear: Franklin's relationship with Celia had been strained, and whatever conflict they'd faced had taken a toll on him. Leaving the interrogation room, Carter regrouped with her team, feeling the weight of the questions still unanswered. Franklin's hazy recollections and the cryptic messages from G pointed to a web of secrets, one that stretched beyond a simple domestic dispute. To understand Celia's death, she would need to uncover the true nature of this hidden relationship, and perhaps confront the darker side of the Hendricks family itself. Outside the police station, Serenity Valley's residents were abuzz with speculation. As word of the investigation spread, stories emerged of Celia's recent behavior. Some neighbors had noticed that she seemed distracted, her once warm demeanor replaced by a distant, troubled expression. Others recalled seeing Gerald stopping by the house more frequently, his presence lingering long after Franklin had left for work. The gossip and rumors grew, painting a picture of a family with hidden tension simmering beneath the surface. Carter could feel the weight of the community's unease as she prepared to delve deeper into the Hendricks' lives. There were layers to this story, and she sensed that, as each one was peeled back, more disturbing truths would emerge. Detective Rosalind Carter spent the days following Celia's death combing through every detail of the Hendricks' lives. The picture that emerged from the community's whispers, Franklin's vague testimony, and Celia's hidden messages painted a much darker portrait than anyone could have anticipated. Each new piece of information felt like a brick in a wall of secrets, one she would need to dismantle carefully to uncover the truth. The first lead Carter pursued was the series of text messages from G. After a meticulous review of Celia's phone records, it became clear that Gerald Hendricks, Franklin's father, was indeed G. The pattern of messages suggested not only an intimate relationship, but also hinted at a growing tension between Celia and Gerald. In the days leading up to her death, Celia had attempted to distance herself from him, sending cryptic messages that conveyed guilt, frustration, and hints of fear. The more Carter read, the more she sensed that Celia had felt trapped, caught between Gerald's expectations and her own conscience. To explore this further, Carter brought Gerald in for questioning. Gerald Hendricks entered the station with the same calm demeanor he projected around Serenity Valley. He was a well-liked former police chief, someone the townspeople respected. His presence was a stark contrast to his son's withdrawn demeanor. Dressed impeccably, Gerald appeared outwardly unbothered, almost indifferent to the tragedy that had unfolded. But Carter could sense a tension just below the surface, an impatience he was trying hard to mask. In the interrogation room, Carter observed Gerald's behavior carefully as she began with basic questions. Gerald's responses were controlled, precise, and evasive. He explained his frequent visits to the house as simply helping out his son's family, brushing off any suggestion of improper intentions. But when Carter confronted him with the messages on Celia's phone, his facade slipped, just slightly, his jaw clenched, and his responses became clipped. Gerald claimed the messages were misunderstood, insisting that his relationship with Celia was entirely appropriate, though his tone suggested otherwise. Celia was troubled, he said finally, his voice cool. She didn't always know what she wanted. I was merely trying to guide her. She needed someone stable in her life. Carter noted his choice of words, the subtle undertones of possessiveness. His response hinted at an almost parental concern, yet with a disturbing, underlying familiarity. She pressed him further, questioning his intentions and involvement in the events leading up to Celia's death. Gerald's answers were carefully crafted, each word chosen to deflect suspicion, yet his mask of calmness grew thin as the questions intensified. His rationalization of Celia's emotions, his use of phrases like guiding her and someone stable, left Carter with an unsettling feeling. He wasn't simply denying the relationship, he was trying to control the narrative. After hours of questioning, Carter had none direct confession or evidence to charge Gerald, but she had observed enough to sense that he played a significant role in the tragic events. She released him, knowing he would remain under scrutiny. There was a coldness in his demeanor as he left, a hint of disdain in his eyes that only reinforced her suspicions. In the following days, Carter intensified her focus on Franklin, hoping he might unknowingly reveal more about his father's influence and the dynamics in their family. Through additional questioning, Franklin admitted that he had noticed a shift in Celia's behavior. He recalled how she had grown distant, how she had spent more time away from the home, and how she seemed to tense up whenever Gerald was around. Despite this, Franklin continued to defend his father, seemingly in denial about the depth of Gerald's interference. There was nothing unusual about my father's presence, Franklin repeated, almost as if convincing himself. He just wanted what was best for us. But Carter sensed that Franklin's loyalty was blinding him, keeping him from acknowledging the toxic influence Gerald wielded over both his life and Celia's. Franklin's unwavering defense of his father hinted at years of deeply ingrained control that went beyond simple family loyalty. Carter wondered if Franklin himself had become a pawn in Gerald's game, manipulated into doubting his own perceptions and ultimately fueling the tension that had led to Celia's death. As Carter pieced together the family's dynamics, the story grew increasingly unsettling. Gerald's manipulation appeared to extend not only to Celia, but to Franklin as well, casting a shadow over every interaction and decision they made. The idea that Gerald had somehow orchestrated or provoked the events that led to Celia's tragic end began to solidify in her mind, but proving it would be another matter entirely. Determined to unravel the truth, Carter ordered a closer examination of Gerald's financial records. Her instincts told her that his motivations might be rooted in more than just control or emotional entanglement. If Gerald's influence over Celia and Franklin went beyond family ties, there might be financial strings attached, strings that would expose his true intentions. What the records revealed was another piece of the puzzle. A sizable life insurance policy taken out on Celia, naming Gerald as a beneficiary. The policy had been set up several months prior, around the same time that Celia's messages to Gerald had begun to show signs of distress. It was a discovery that darkened the picture even further, suggesting that Gerald had a tangible, vested interest in Celia's demise. With this new information, Carter was able to construct a chilling narrative. Gerald's connection to Celia had not been purely emotional or protective. It had been strategic, calculated. His involvement in her life had escalated over time, his influence growing stronger as he cultivated her reliance on him. And when Celia had tried to distance herself, Gerald's grip had tightened, his motives shifting from manipulation to something far more dangerous. Though Carter still lacked definitive proof tying Gerald directly to Celia's death, she felt the weight of her suspicions more heavily than ever. Each clue, from Franklin's blind loyalty to Gerald's cold rationalizations, painted the portrait of a man whose control over those around him was both calculated and relentless. Yet the delicate web of influence and fear Gerald had spun around his family had kept the truth just out of reach. As the days turned into weeks, Carter pressed on, seeking the one piece of evidence that would expose Gerald's role in the tragedy that had torn the Hendricks family apart. The investigation was far from over, and with every layer she peeled back, Carter grew more certain that Serenity Valley's darkest secrets had yet to be uncovered. Detective Rosalind Carter was methodical in her pursuit, each step of the investigation adding layers to an increasingly dark and complex story. Gerald Hendricks was no longer merely a former police chief and father figure. He was emerging as a puppet master, a figure whose influence reached deep into the lives of those around him. The life insurance policy in Celia's name had provided Carter with a significant lead, yet Gerald's stoic demeanor and meticulous caution in covering his tracks kept direct evidence frustratingly out of reach. As she continued piecing together the story, Carter turned her focus to Celia's background. There was something about her vulnerability in those last text messages that made Carter wonder if Gerald had chosen her for those very qualities. Digging into Celia's past, Carter discovered that Celia had moved to Serenity Valley with little family of her own, a young woman seeking stability after a series of failed relationships. She was in many ways a perfect target for someone like Gerald, who thrived on molding others to his will. Her desire for acceptance had likely been preyed upon, skillfully exploited by a man who understood psychological manipulation intimately. While tracking Celia's former contacts and acquaintances, Carter found someone who had known Celia during her early years in Serenity Valley, Miriam Poe, a former co-worker of Celia's. Miriam described how Celia had once been a lively, spirited person, but that a shift had occurred around the time she met Franklin and his family. This change, Miriam explained, was subtle at first. Celia became quieter, less spontaneous, and eventually withdrew from her social circles entirely. Miriam attributed this transformation to Gerald's influence, saying that she had noticed how Celia became increasingly deferential to his opinions, as if he held a power over her that went beyond mere respect. What Miriam shared only reinforced Carter's suspicions. The process of Celia's isolation was evident, and Gerald had slowly molded her world until she felt she had no choice but to depend on him, even as he controlled her with veiled threats disguised as fatherly advice. The more Carter learned, the clearer it became that Gerald's influence on Celia was not simply manipulation. It was a form of psychological entrapment that bordered on coercion. Carter delved further into Gerald's financial dealings, suspecting that, if his reach extended into Celia's life so deeply, there might be more to discover. Through painstaking analysis of his accounts, she found evidence of suspicious financial transactions. Gerald had established a series of small, seemingly inconsequential accounts, some of which showed regular deposits that eventually made their way into Celia's own finances. These deposits, hidden through layers of redirection, painted a picture of silent control. The money moved silently between Gerald and Celia, masking dependency as support. This pattern was orchestrated to make Celia reliant on him, her financial stability firmly tied to Gerald. Meanwhile, Carter found herself at odds with her own department. The police force in Serenity Valley, still holding Gerald in high esteem, doubted her theory. The evidence was circumstantial, they argued, and Gerald's community standing made accusations of such malicious intent seem almost unfathomable. Yet Carter couldn't ignore the subtle threat beneath Gerald's polished exterior, the coldness that lurked in his words, the carefully measured facade that barely concealed a chilling indifference. She realized she needed something concrete, something indisputable that would tie Gerald directly to Celia's death. Carter reviewed every aspect of the Hendricks' home, looking for the one clue that might break the case wide open. She instructed forensic specialists to comb over the crime scene once again, focusing on any overlooked details. They uncovered small traces of tranquilizers embedded in the fibers of Celia's bedroom carpet, hinting that she may have been subdued prior to her death. Though it didn't directly implicate Gerald, the discovery raised further suspicions that her death had been planned, possibly with Franklin as the unwitting tool. Carter speculated that Gerald had manipulated Franklin's fragile mental state. There were hints of depression in Franklin's recent medical history, a fact that Gerald would have known given his closeness to his son. It became plausible that Gerald might have subtly influenced Franklin, exploiting his vulnerabilities to incite a confrontation with Celia. If Gerald had planted the seeds of doubt and resentment in Franklin's mind, leading him to believe that Celia was unfaithful or plotting against him, then Gerald could have orchestrated the fatal encounter without physically participating in the act itself. The idea took shape in Carter's mind, chilling in its implications. Gerald had not simply controlled Celia, he had likely manipulated his own son, leading him down a path of psychological instability. Gerald's influence over Franklin was deep-rooted, a hold on him that had started in childhood and evolved into something far darker in adulthood. Franklin had become a pawn in his father's hands, and Celia's death was the ultimate outcome of Gerald's twisted machinations. With each new piece of the puzzle, Carter felt the grip of Gerald's shadow tighten around the Hendricks family, suffocating and omnipresent. The connections were still too tenuous for a solid case, but the pattern was becoming unmistakable. She knew that she was dealing with a man who understood how to exploit the weaknesses of others with clinical precision, a man who left no evidence behind, yet orchestrated tragedy with chilling expertise. As Carter prepared to confront Gerald again, she realized that she was facing a formidable adversary. He would not break easily, nor would he allow himself to be exposed without a fight. She would need to tread carefully, gathering every shred of evidence, every whispered confession, and every loose thread, until she had enough to tear down the carefully constructed facade Gerald had built. The Hendricks family's secrets were slowly coming to light, but Carter knew that exposing the full extent of Gerald's control would be the most challenging battle of her career. The shadows of Serenity Valley held many secrets, and as she prepared for the next steps in her investigation, Carter steeled herself for the path ahead. In the days following the discovery of the tranquilizer traces in Celia's bedroom, Detective Rosalind Carter knew she was close to unraveling the full extent of Gerald Hendricks' manipulation. Every lead, every detail she had meticulously pieced together, painted a portrait of a man who wielded control like a weapon, with both Celia and Franklin caught in his web. Gerald's influence was powerful, yet nearly invisible. His tactics refined to ensure he stayed out of sight while those around him fell apart. To expose him, Carter would need to prove the link between Gerald's manipulation and the ultimate tragedy that had shattered the Hendricks family. She began by delving into Franklin's psychiatric history. Records revealed a series of therapy sessions Franklin had attended a few years prior, where he had sought help for anxiety and depression. The records described his low self-esteem, pervasive feelings of inadequacy, and a deep-seated need to prove himself, a need that had likely been fueled by Gerald's persistent criticism over the years. Franklin's fragile mental state made him vulnerable to his father's suggestions, even the subtlest ones. Gerald's hold on Franklin was powerful, reinforced by years of psychological conditioning that left Franklin dependent on his father's approval. The more Carter uncovered, the more she saw Gerald's manipulation as an insidious, layered influence. She now believed Gerald had planted ideas in Franklin's mind about Celia's supposed infidelity and lack of loyalty, fueling Franklin's insecurities until they became an obsession. This wasn't just a father guiding his son. It was a calculated attempt to drive a wedge between Franklin and Celia, pushing them to the edge. Realizing she needed a deeper understanding of Gerald's relationship with Franklin, Carter sought out Dr. Vincent Webb, Franklin's former therapist. Dr. Webb was initially hesitant to discuss his sessions with Franklin, citing patient confidentiality. But after Carter presented her case, explaining the gravity of the situation, Dr. Webb reluctantly shared general observations that corroborated her suspicions. He described Franklin as a man haunted by inadequacy, driven by a need for approval he could never fully receive. Though Dr. Webb never directly mentioned Gerald, his description of Franklin's sense of inferiority and constant self-doubt hinted at a long history of emotional manipulation. Meanwhile, Carter's team continued combing through Gerald's financial records and personal affairs. They discovered that Gerald had a habit of transferring small sums of money into Franklin's bank account at irregular intervals, amounts too trivial to raise suspicion individually. But over time, these payments added up, representing a quiet reinforcement of Gerald's hold on his son. The timing of each transfer suggested a pattern, one that subtly coincided with Franklin's moments of doubt or emotional struggle, as if Gerald had been using money as a tool to maintain Franklin's dependency. This revelation, though indirect, spoke volumes. Gerald had not only manipulated Franklin's emotions, but had also ensured that Franklin remained financially and psychologically tied to him. The effect was chilling. Franklin had been systematically trapped, his own father shaping him into a man unable to break free or think independently. Gerald's control over Franklin was a carefully orchestrated symphony of influence. each note played to perfection to keep his son tethered and compliant. The depth of Gerald's control led Carter to review her notes on Celia's interactions with Gerald. The messages from G painted a clear picture. Gerald had been both a confidant and a tormentor. He had supported Celia financially, but had also encouraged her to confide in him, to lean on him as a source of stability, while gradually isolating her from Franklin. Celia's last messages to Gerald, filled with fear and regret, suggested that she had tried to break free, perhaps realizing the extent of Gerald's influence. But Gerald had tightened his grip, ensuring she remained ensnared in his plans. The final piece of the puzzle was Franklin's behavior on the night of Celia's death. Through surveillance footage from nearby street cameras, Carter confirmed that Franklin had been home during the critical hours. But the footage also showed Gerald arriving at Franklin's house earlier that evening, only to leave minutes before the police were called. This fleeting visit was enough to suggest that Gerald might have instigated the fatal confrontation between Franklin and Celia. It was plausible that Gerald had stoked Franklin's suspicions and insecurities just enough to push him over the edge. Though Carter now had a clearer picture of Gerald's actions, the lack of direct evidence tying him to Celia's death continued to frustrate her. She needed Franklin's testimony, the one piece that could confirm Gerald's manipulations. But Franklin, trapped in a haze of grief and confusion, had refused to speak further, retreating deeper into himself with each passing day. Determined to break through Franklin's silence, Carter decided to confront him one last time. She met with him in the sterile, echoing halls of the county jail, hoping that her accumulated evidence would push him to confront the truth. She laid out the financial records, the psychological manipulation, and the hidden control that Gerald had wielded over his life. She described how Gerald had isolated him from Celia, how he had sown doubt and distrust, and how he had ensured that Franklin remained loyal and dependent. She revealed the tranquilizers found in Celia's room, suggesting that Gerald might have incapacitated her, setting the stage for the confrontation. Slowly, as Carter recounted the details, Franklin's expression shifted from confusion to horror. The realization dawned on him in waves, each revelation stripping away the illusions he had held about his father. The impact was overwhelming, leaving him visibly shaken, and Carter watched as he struggled to process the betrayal. It was a quiet, devastating moment, as Franklin began to understand the true nature of his father's control and the depth of the manipulation he had endured. While Franklin couldn't recall the exact details of that night, Carter's evidence had planted a seed of doubt strong enough to compel him to speak. He agreed to testify against his father, his statement describing years of subtle control, emotional abuse, and psychological manipulation. He recounted Gerald's insidious influence over his marriage, his constant undermining of Celia, and his manipulation of Franklin's vulnerabilities. Though he remained vague about the events of that fateful night, his testimony provided a damning portrait of Gerald's control over their lives. Armed with Franklin's statement, Carter was able to confront Gerald one final time. Though Gerald remained composed, his denial had lost its conviction. With Franklin's testimony, Carter had the foundation she needed to pursue formal charges, and the walls of Gerald's carefully constructed world began to crumble. The shadows surrounding the Hendricks family secrets had finally been illuminated, exposing a legacy of control, betrayal, and tragedy that had destroyed more than just lives. It had shattered trust and left a scar on Serenity Valley that would never fully heal. As the evidence piled up in the courtroom, Detective Rosalind Carter watched the case against Gerald Hendricks reach its inevitable conclusion. The months of investigation had revealed an unsettling tapestry of control and manipulation woven into the fabric of the Hendricks family's life. Each piece of evidence, Franklin's halting testimony, the financial ties, the life insurance policy, and the meticulously crafted psychological traps Gerald had set, painted a portrait of a man who had turned affection into a weapon and family into a prison. Gerald Hendricks' grip over his son and daughter-in-law had ultimately led to Celia's tragic death, but he had left a trail that even he could not erase. The jury's expressions were grim as the prosecution made its final case. Gerald's carefully curated facade was gone, stripped away by the revelations of his calculated abuse. His calm mask cracked under the weight of the accusations, and for the first time, the community saw him as he truly was, a man whose desire for control overshadowed any true affection for his family. His presence, once commanding respect, now provoked only horror and disgust from those who had once trusted him. When the guilty verdict was delivered, Gerald remained stoic, yet the confidence in his gaze had dimmed. He was convicted on charges of coercion, psychological abuse, and criminally negligent involvement in the events leading to Celia's death. Though the verdict fell short of a murder conviction, it was enough to destroy his reputation and ensure he would never again wield power over his family or his community. As he was led away, his cold eyes met Carter's with a flash of bitterness, a final silent accusation that she had unraveled his carefully constructed life. In the days following the trial, the town of Serenity Valley felt the weight of the story they had witnessed. The community that had once admired Gerald was left to grapple with the implications of his actions. Franklin, now free from his father's oppressive shadow, faced the daunting task of rebuilding his life amidst the memories of Celia and the knowledge of his own role in the tragic end. The scars left by Gerald's manipulation ran deep. Franklin's recovery would be long, his psyche marked indelibly by the realization that the man he had once trusted had shaped his life through calculated cruelty. Detective Carter, too, was left with her own reflections. In solving the case, she had exposed a chilling truth about the power of influence and the darkness that can lie behind even the most trusted facade. Gerald's calculated control over his family had blurred the lines between love and possession, showing how a person could turn affection into a tool for domination. His subtle, relentless pressure on Franklin had twisted a son's loyalty into dependency, eroding his sense of self until Gerald's perspective became Franklin's reality. Gerald's ability to manipulate his family's emotions had driven them to the brink, leaving devastation in its wake. As the sun set on Serenity Valley, Carter looked out over the quiet streets, considering the lesson the Hendricks case had left behind. The cost of control, she realized, was always paid in human lives, sometimes through quiet suffering, sometimes in tragic loss. Gerald had shown the darkest side of power, teaching a sobering lesson about the dangers of unchecked influence and emotional manipulation. The tragedy underscored a harsh truth. Those who seek to dominate others under the guise of love often leave destruction in their path. For the community of Serenity Valley, the Hendricks family's story became a somber reminder to look beyond appearances, to question the intentions behind influence, and to understand that true love empowers rather than controls. And for Franklin, the journey ahead would be a testament to resilience. The journey of a man who had lost everything, yet held within him the possibility of reclaiming his life, free from the shadows of his father's toxic legacy. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.